Good evening again. If you were on my personal page, anyway, if not, good evening and welcome. I'm Dr. Melissa Green. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and registered yoga teacher. Last week, I talked to you about dementia and the more prominent types of dementia. And this week, I'm going to shift it a little bit and focus on those people who actually have loved ones who are living with dementia, and talk a little bit about caregiving and some of the things that people who are caring for people who are living with dementia may experience. So I want to go through some statistics that I ran across. Let me just get to my notes that I thought were pretty significant. And this is really why it's important to talk about this topic. So according to the CDC, the life expectancy at birth now in the U.S. is 76.1. And for non-Hispanic Black people, the life expectancy is 70.8 years. And for women, it is 79.1, and for men, it's 73.2. And according to a report from the Alzheimer's Association, it's estimated that by 2050, the number of people who are 65 and over who are living with Alzheimer's type dementia, it's projected to reach 12.7 million in the U.S., which is a lot. And that's compared to about 6.5 million now, Americans who are living with Alzheimer's disease. So there will be a continuing need for caregivers and family caregivers, particularly of people who are living with different types of dementia. Older Black Americans are twice as likely to have Alzheimer's or some other type of dementia than older whites, and older Hispanics are about 1.5 times as likely to have Alzheimer's or some type of dementia than older whites. Also, let's see, 1 in 3 older adults die with Alzheimer's or some type of dementia, and that's more than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. So between the years of 2000 and 2019, the deaths that were related to Alzheimer's disease, they doubled, and the deaths that were associated with heart disease, which is the leading cause of death across the world, those deaths actually decreased, right? So you can see that there may be a shift over time in, where we start to focus more of our attention and efforts on assisting with research and caregiving for people who are living with dementia and Alzheimer's particularly. Some more statistics that came from a report that was released by AARP and the National Alliance for Caregiving. They noted that 3 in 5 caregivers, or about 60%, are women, and 2 in 5, or about 40%, are men, and more than 1 in 5 Americans, or about 20%, are caregivers either to an adult or a child with special needs. And the bulk of those caregivers range in age from 50 to 64. So that's where most of the people fall who are caring for either a child or for an aging parent. And almost half of the people who are caring for older adults, they and particularly someone living with dementia, they're doing it in the community. So they definitely need more support. and about a quarter of dementia caregivers are a part of what is referred to as the sandwich generation. And when we say that, we mean that they are caring for an aging parent while also caring for at least one child. So they're kind of stuck in the middle, right? And that's why it's called the sandwich generation. And not many people are really prepared for the responsibilities and the tasks that are required when you have to care for a loved one who is either ill or disabled or elderly. So there are different stages that caregivers go through, and I want to walk through those generally. And you may hear the stages categorized a little bit differently when you hear other people talk about it, but generally we're talking about the same things that people experience when they are in a caregiving role. So the first stage is learning about what the person needs. And this is really more of an assessment phase when you first, and I'm thinking particularly for someone who has some type of dementia. I have mentioned before that my father, I believe I mentioned this in one of the earlier Facebook Lives that I did. My father was diagnosed with 2 types of dementia back in 2014. He was diagnosed with vascular dementia, and he was also diagnosed with Alzheimer's type dementia. And so as soon as I learned that, and my family learned it, we needed to know more about what we could do to help him. And so one of the ways that you can find out about how you can help is to talk with your loved one's doctor, primary care doctor. And if you're really interested in learning more, I have a resource that's free that I will put the link to it below the talk here. And it lists 7 helpful evaluations if you suspect dementia. There are lots of things that can be done. Some things may or may not be offered because of a person's the type of medical care or insurance that they have, but it wouldn't hurt to ask for these evaluations that are listed in that resource. So the more information that you have and that your loved one's doctor has, the more robust the treatment plan can be and more thorough it will be. So they may recommend things like MRI or CT scans to look at the brain, testing that looks at memory and learning and those kind of things, and even basic things, that you might not think to check, like hearing and vision, are important to have screened when a person has been diagnosed with some type of dementia, because we want to make sure that we know exactly, where that person is as far as their baseline of functioning at the time that they have been diagnosed. And that way we will have a gauge, or you will have a gauge to compare them to as they progress throughout the different stages of the disease. The second stage is a stage that involves building a support team. So once you have had all of the evaluations, excuse me, and assessments conducted, and you got the findings from those evaluations, then a treatment plan has been developed, or you have recommendations about things to do. Now it's time to implement the plan, and you have to figure out who the players are going to be to help you to implement this plan. And during this phase, you have to make a lot of major life decisions. You might have to decide whether or not your loved one is capable of living independently, if they were living independently or remaining in their home, even if they are living with someone else. They may be living with a spouse who is also elderly, who may not be able to provide all of the support that they need. So that may be something to consider, whether or not the person needs to have more people coming into the home to help and support him or her. Excuse me. And if so, are those people going to be family members, or are they going to be paid sitters or caregivers that come into the home? If they are family members, are you going to outline a schedule, a rotating schedule of who can come and when? So those are things that you have to consider. Or is the person at the point where they maybe need a higher level of care, where they might need to be placed in a facility outside of the home so that they can get all of their needs met? You might also have to make decisions about managing the person's affairs. So somebody may have to be named, may have to be given power of attorney, and that's something that you would discuss amongst your family members if you are not an only child. And as much as possible, you would also obviously talk to the person who is living with dementia about, what their wishes are as far as, having someone there to manage their finances and their other affairs if necessary. You may have to have some talks with family members about how to manage medical issues as far as transportation, who will take that person to and from their appointments if they're not able to do so themselves. Who will manage their medication. Now, if this is not something, typically when you first realize that this person has some level of cognitive impairment, they may not need all of these things that I'm mentioning at that point. But as they progress through the disease, they will have higher needs. So it's important to try to plan ahead and think about those kinds of things that you might not need at that moment, but down the line you may need, like power of attorney, or whether or not the person will remain in the home, or assistance with transportation to and from medical appointments, assistance with managing medication. All of those things can become something that the person living with dementia is no longer able to manage on their own, and they will need somebody to assist them with that. And I mentioned how, you have to make decisions about how much a person really can maintain their autonomy. And a big part of many people's autonomy is being able to drive. And sometimes there becomes a point when a person has dementia, most times, honestly, that it's no longer safe for them to drive, either independently or with someone in the car with them, because of the level of cognitive impairment. And that's something else that needs to be discussed. And if the person is not able to do that, who will take them to not only medical appointments, but if they need to go shopping, or if they have other places that they like to go to for leisure activities. That's how you start to build the support team, by naming people who will do all of these things that may not be necessary initially when the person is diagnosed, but would most likely be necessary down the line. And the earlier that you can start to do the planning, the better for everyone involved. And you don't have to make decisions when there's a crisis. The stage 3 is the time that, okay, you have had these assessments, you have come up with your support team and identified, people, whether it's family or professionals, who will be a part of that team and help to execute the treatment plan and support you and your loved one living with dementia. Then you get to stage 3, and at that point, the relationships, particularly with the person who's living with dementia, starts to change, and even other relationships. If you're the caregiver, your relationships with other people may change because you may start to take on new responsibilities that change your availability. Also, people sometimes, if they cannot really relate to what's going on, it may change the nature of your relationship with that person. Your role may start to shift, and if you're the child caring for the parent, then it seems to be like a role reversal where you're caring for your parent in the way that a parent would care for a child. So there's that shift in that dynamic, and there's a balance that you have to strike in still allowing that person, if it's your parent or a loved one that you respect and love, still allowing them to have some decision making power, have some autonomy to whatever degree they can, but also maintaining their safety, because sometimes they may want to make decisions that are not safe, and they may not understand why they're not safe. But you also want to make sure that you're respectful because they are your elder. And there's also a time, and usually during this stage, that as that power or that dynamic shifts, where you may be the one making more decisions for your loved one that they're making for themselves. When that happens, then you start to really become aware of the loss that you have, because there is a loss typically in that relationship. It's not the same. You are not able to communicate with the person, or may not be able to communicate with the person in the way that you communicated with them before they had the disease, and that can be very difficult to deal with. So it's important to understand how a loss can affect you. You could go through the same stages of grief and loss that a person goes through if they lose a person to death. One of the first things that people typically experience is denial, or they may minimize what's going on with the person. I know sometimes people will say, oh, they know what they're doing, oh, they know what they're talking about, they're just being stubborn, when in reality they just don't want to acknowledge the level of impairment that that their loved one has. So it's easier to just deny it or minimize it, because minimizing it keeps you from having to really experience the significance or the gravity of the situation, and it keeps you from having to experience the maybe intense emotions that may go with any thoughts about your loved one or your parent not being able to care for themselves. Some people may deny by minimizing. Some people may go into denial by self-medicating, using alcohol or drugs to make themselves emotionally numb so that they don't really have to acknowledge what's going on. Some people deny by just avoiding being around the person or avoiding talking about the person. That way it's not real to them. If they're not interacting with the person on a regular basis or they're not seeing them, then they don't have to be faced with the hurt that goes along with a loss. Another stage of loss that you may experience if you're a caregiver, particularly of a caregiver with someone with dementia, you might feel angry. You could feel angry towards the person with dementia. You could feel angry towards God or your higher power for placing you and your loved one in that situation. You might feel angry towards other family members who are absent or not as involved, because you may feel like you're taking on the bulk of the responsibility for caring for your loved one. You might also become angry with medical providers because you feel like they're not adequately providing support, or you could have unrealistic expectations, which sometimes we do when we have loved ones who need support or who are sick. We might have unrealistic expectations of medical providers. And the fourth stage is the stage when people start to react more to the loss and to the change, and they may have more intense emotional reactions. That's not uncommon. They may start to feel really sad. So once they really start to understand what's going on and become more aware of what's going on, they may start to feel more intense emotions, and they may try to negotiate with their higher power to relieve them of this tremendous void or this loss that they're experiencing. So they may, and by negotiating, I mean by saying, oh, if I promise I'll go to church from now on, if you let my dad be well, and keep me from feeling this way. And people who start to feel really sad or depressed, they may stop eating. They may start to lose a lot of weight, have problems sleeping. They may even be crying excessively. They could possibly even have thoughts about taking their own lives. So it's important that you be aware of what kind of things could come up as a caregiver, understanding that it's not uncommon for people to have these feelings or certain thoughts, and identifying a support system for yourself. And then at some point, you most likely will come to accept what's really going on. And some people will try to look for a lesson to learn from the experience of the loss. They might find themselves going back and forth, or you may find yourself going back and forth between the different stages of loss, and that's not uncommon. At different points in time, you may feel like you've accepted it, My voice just wants to go away tonight. I'm almost done, thankfully. So you may feel like you have accepted the reality of the situation, what's going on with your loved one with dementia, and then months later, you may be in denial again, or you may have these more intense emotions that are the result of you feeling this huge void. So that's just sort of an overview of the stages of caregiving and a little more specifics about caregiving for a person who's living with dementia. And next week, I will talk a little bit more about the emotional toll of caregiving, particularly of someone who's living with dementia. So if you suspect that someone you know has dementia and you want to get them evaluated, or you want some guidance on what evaluations you should request, you can grab my free resource that I will have the link to in the comments. It's 7 evaluations if you suspect dementia. And I hope you have a great Thanksgiving holiday if you celebrate it. Good night. It's Dr. Melissa Green, licensed psychologist and registered yoga teacher.